If you saw a lioness walking silently through a cemetery, would you run or stay and watch? That morning, under the pale sky of a South African village, mourners gathered to say goodbye to a man who had spent the last decade of his life in quiet isolation. Peter van der Meer, 68, wasn't famous, wealthy, or particularly known to most. But in his small wooden cabin on the edge of the bush, he had lived a life filled with quiet acts of care, especially for the animals that others had forgotten. No one expected a large crowd at his funeral, and that's exactly what it looked like. A modest group of neighbors, a local pastor, and a few former colleagues. The wind was dry, the soil freshly turned. Just as the final words of prayer were spoken, a strange stillness fell over the crowd. That's when someone gasped and pointed beyond the line of trees. She emerged without a sound, a lioness, golden and slow, her eyes fixed on the fresh grave. No one moved. Peter had spent the last 10 years tending to injured animals brought to the nearby reserve. He never took credit, never asked for help, and never posted pictures. After losing his wife to cancer, he withdrew from most people, but found a strange comfort in the company of the wild. He built trust the way others built fences, with patience, calm, and silence. His routine was simple. Wake up before dawn, check the perimeters, clean out the cages, and leave bits of food near the trees for the animals he knew would never come too close. But one had. Years ago, a female lion, barely old enough to survive, was found limping near the edge of the reserve. Her paw was badly infected and she refused to let anyone near, except Peter. For weeks, he simply sat nearby. No cage, no trap, just presence. And eventually, she came. That lioness, later nicknamed Lindiwe by the local rangers, was nursed back to health with quiet devotion. Peter never treated her like a pet. He respected her wildness, never tried to contain it. Once she recovered, she disappeared into the reserve, and Peter never spoke of her again. Those who knew of the story thought it ended there. But on the day of his funeral, as the last words echoed over the grave, Lindiwe returned. Not with roar or menace, but with a stillness that unsettled everyone present. Her massive paws barely disturbed the earth as she walked past the mourners. And then, she did something no one could have expected. She approached the fresh grave and sat down, her amber eyes locked on the mound of dirt. Then she lay down slowly, her massive body curling gently beside it. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if time paused. The wind didn't blow. The birds fell silent, and every person there felt something they couldn't explain. A ranger named Sifo, who had worked with Peter briefly, whispered, "It's her. That's Lindiwe." Still, no one could understand. How did she know he was gone? How had she found her way through fences and hills to this very spot, on this very day? Then came the moment that stunned everyone. She placed her paw on the earth covering Peter and let out a low, guttural moan. It wasn't a roar, it was grief. A woman near the back began to cry, not for Peter, whom she hadn't really known, but for the impossible bond playing out in front of her. Some pulled out their phones, but most lowered them again, too moved to record. This wasn't something to film, it was something to feel. The lioness stayed there, unmoving, her body a golden statue of loyalty. As minutes passed, people began to leave quietly, still looking back in disbelief. The pastor didn't finish the ceremony. He just stood there, hat in hand, whispering something only he could hear. Eventually, only Sifo remained, watching from a distance, his eyes wet. That night, word of the event spread through the village like wildfire. Some thought it was a sign. Others tried to explain it with logic. Scent trails, instinct, coincidence. But for those who had been there, logic wasn't enough. What they had seen transcended explanation. Sifo returned to the grave later that evening. Lindiwe was gone, but her paw prints circled the grave in wide, deliberate loops, as if she'd been keeping watch. He knelt down, touched the soil, and whispered, he wasn't alone after all. That simple truth shook something inside him. For years, Sifo had been questioning his own place in the reserve, in the world. But that lioness had left more than tracks. She'd left a message. And so began a story not about death, but about connection. One that would unravel layers of silence and solitude left behind by Peter's quiet life. In the days that followed, Sifo returned to the cabin Peter had once called home. It was just as he had left it, clean, spare, with photos of his wife still on the wall. On the desk, Sifo found a journal. No long entries, just short notes, dates, times, animal sightings, and one repeated line. "She's watching." The more Sifo read, the more he understood. Peter had known Lindiwe never truly left. She had always lingered nearby, unseen. And now, with Peter gone, she had stepped into the open. But why now? Why here? Sifo couldn't sleep. He kept returning to the journal, flipping through pages, looking for meaning. He remembered how Peter once told him, "Some bonds don't need words. Some goodbyes come long after death." That night, unable to rest, Sifo returned once more to the grave. He brought a lantern and sat down beside the mound, listening. The moon was high, the air still. And then a sound from the trees. Soft, deliberate footsteps. Lindiwe. Again. This time she didn't come to lie down. She stood several feet away, staring at Sifo. Their eyes met. Neither moved. And something passed between them. Not fear, not threat. Just understanding. The next morning, Sifo made a decision. He wouldn't leave the reserve. He wouldn't transfer as he'd planned. He would stay. Not just for the animals, but to continue what Peter had begun. He opened the gates again, cleared the cabin, and posted a handwritten sign. "Sanctuary of Silence, in memory of Peter Vandermeer." It wasn't much, but it was something. And in the days that followed, strange things began to happen. Injured animals started appearing near the perimeter again. A wounded kudu, a limping jackal. As if the wild itself had sensed a return of kindness, Sifo didn't question it. He just got to work. The following week, Sifo found himself haunted by the lioness's gaze. It wasn't just the mystery of how she knew Peter had died. It was the way she looked at him, as if passing a burden. Every day he returned to the grave, finding fresh paw prints always in a circle, always deliberate. At first he thought it might be coincidence, but as the days passed he realized she was coming back. Not for Peter, but for something else. Sifo couldn't stop thinking, what if this lioness had returned not just to mourn, but to protect something? Maybe someone. He started sleeping less, walking the reserve with Peter's old notes, trying to understand what he had missed. And then came the sound. A soft, almost imperceptible cry in the bush behind Peter's cabin. At first he thought it was the wind, but as he approached, the sound grew clearer. It wasn't wind. It was a cub. A small lion cub, no older than a few weeks, lay curled under a fallen branch, thin, shivering, alone. Sifo froze. His heart pounded. Had Lindiwe? Could she have brought it here? Or worse, abandoned it? He didn't know what to do. The cub looked up with weak, dull eyes. No growl, no attempt to run. Just a quiet, exhausted stare. Sifo moved closer, crouching slowly, whispering low words he wasn't sure the cub could understand. The cub didn't move. He was too weak. And in that moment, something clicked. This wasn't just a chance discovery. This was a test. He scooped the cub gently into a blanket, careful not to leave a scent trail too strong. If the mother was nearby, he didn't want to be mistaken for a threat, but the bush remained silent. No rustle, no roar, no sign of Lindiwe. Back at the cabin, he laid the cub on a towel, prepared water, and pulled out old supplies Peter had left behind. Feeding syringes, powdered formula, antiseptic. It was all still here, as if Peter had known the time would come again. As Sifo worked, he felt an emotion he hadn't allowed himself in years. Fear, not of the lioness, but of letting this cub die. Because now, he understood. Lindiwe hadn't come to grieve. She had come to entrust something precious. The cub, whom he quietly named Temba, meaning hope, clung to life with a fragile grip. He wouldn't eat it first, but Sifo stayed by his side through the night. He played soft recordings of wild sounds Peter had once used to calm animals. He placed a warm cloth beside him to mimic the mother's body heat. Hour by hour, by breath, the cub began to respond. By morning, his ears twitched. A tiny paw moved. Sifo dared not hope too much, but a spark had been lit. Still, there were risks. The reserve had strict rules about wild animal handling. Sifo was no longer a full-time ranger. Technically, he had no authority. If caught, he could be suspended, even charged. But he couldn't walk away anymore. Not after what he'd seen at the grave. Not after finding Temba. That day, he drove to the main office of the reserve, journal in hand, and requested a special exemption. A temporary caretaker license under the name of Peter van der Meer. The board was skeptical. Some thought Sifo had imagined it all. The lioness, the grave, the cub. But then he showed them the paw prints, the photographs, the journal notes. And then he said something that silenced the room. You can treat this as a violation if you want, but this isn't just a lion cub. This is Peter's legacy, and I'm not letting it die in the bush. The room fell into a long silence. Finally, the reserve director, a woman named Thandi, stood and said, "We'll give you 30 days. If the cub survives, if you follow protocol, we'll reassess." It wasn't a full approval, but it was enough. Sifo returned to the cabin that night with a mix of relief and dread. The responsibility was enormous, but when he opened the door and saw Temba lift his tiny head with a weak chirp, all doubt melted away. He whispered, "We're going to do this together, little one." And deep in the bush, as the wind rustled the trees, he imagined Lindiwe watching, not with worry, but with trust. Caring for Temba became Sifo's entire world. He fed him every 3 hours, cleaned his bedding, measured his weight, tracked his vitals. He documented everything meticulously, just as Peter had. The days blurred together, marked only by the rhythm of survival. Temba grew slowly, gaining strength, learning to stand, then stumble, then walk. His golden eyes watched Sifo with growing curiosity, recognition, and at night, Sifo kept a small lantern lit, not for himself, but in case Lindiwe returned. And one night, she did. She stood on the hill behind the grave, watching silently as if counting breaths. Sifo didn't move. He just nodded once, and she vanished again. But not everyone believed in Sifo's cause. Some colleagues accused him of exploiting the story for attention. Rumors spread that he was using the cub to rebuild his career, that he'd staged the whole thing. He ignored them, mostly. But one day, a government inspector arrived at the reserve unannounced. A quiet, stern man with a clipboard and no patience for emotion. He questioned everything, demanded logs, inspected the cabin, took photos. And then, he said something that struck Sifo like a blow. A cub raised by humans becomes a liability. What happens when it grows up? Sifo had no answer, only a belief that some animals, like some people, aren't meant to be left behind. That night, Temba fell ill. His temperature spiked. He refused food. Sifo sat beside him, heart pounding, remembering Peter's old words. They'll teach you fear, but they'll also teach you trust. You just have to earn it. He didn't sleep. He wrapped the cub, rocked him gently, whispered old lullabies his mother had sung when he was a child. And just before dawn, the fever broke. Temba stirred, opened his eyes, and licked Sifo's hand. It was the first time. Not survival, connection. And in that simple act, Sifo knew. They were both still healing, but neither was alone anymore. As the 30 days approached, the question of what came next grew heavier. Temba could not stay in the cabin forever, but releasing him too early could mean death, and keeping him too long could change him. Sifo sat at the grave one evening, looking at Peter's name etched into the stone. "What would you do?" he whispered. The wind answered in silence. And then, from the bush, a movement, a shape. Lindiwe. She came slowly, stopping just within sight. Sifo held his breath. Temba, still wobbly, padded forward, letting out a soft mewl. Lindiwe didn't move, but her eyes glowed. And in that impossible stillness, Sifo understood. She wasn't here to take him back. She was here to see if he belonged. The next morning, the sun rose gently over the reserve, painting gold across the earth as if blessing the new chapter ahead. Temba had survived the night, and now he stood on his own 4 legs, A bit unsure, still thin but unmistakably alive. Sifo sat nearby, watching with cautious pride. For the first time, Temba approached his food without prompting. He sniffed, then took a few bites, chewing with slow determination. That single act, eating on his own, felt like a victory parade. Sifo marked it in the journal. Day 29, first independent feeding. But as joy settled in, so did the reality. Tomorrow, the board would reevaluate the case. Time was running out. Later that day, Thandi arrived, clipboard in hand, accompanied by the same inspector who had doubted Sifo weeks before. They stood near the cabin, watching Temba from a safe distance. "He's alert," Thandi noted. "Stronger than I expected." Sifo said little. He simply opened the journal, handed it to her, and stepped back. As she flipped through the pages, the inspector remained skeptical. "He's still dependent. He doesn't fear humans. That's not good." Sifo turned to him, calm but firm. "He trusts. That's different. Fear isn't survival. Connection is." Thandi paused, reading an entry aloud. "She's watching. Is this about the lioness?" Sifo nodded. "She brought him here. I'm just trying not to fail her." The inspector scoffed, but Thandi silenced him with a glance. Then she made a surprising offer, a trial reintroduction, a carefully monitored release near the reserve's observation zone. Temba would be given a chance to explore under supervision, with cameras tracking his responses. "We'll see if he's ready," she said. Sifo agreed, heart pounding. The next morning, they transported Temba in a reinforced crate to a quiet glade bordered by trees, near the spot where Lindiwe had first appeared. As Sifo opened the door, Temba hesitated. His nose twitched. His paws pressed against the edge, uncertain. And then, he stepped out, into sunlight, into freedom. At first, he moved awkwardly, sniffing the grass, blinking at the sky. Then, something remarkable happened. From the far tree line, a shadow emerged. Lindiwe. She didn't charge, didn't roar. She simply stood there, watching. Temba froze. The rangers gripped their tranquilizer rifles. Sifo raised his hand. No one moves. The cub stared at the lioness. A pause. Then he took a step forward. And another. Lindiwe lowered her head slightly, a silent gesture of recognition. The two stood less than 10 feet apart. Temba chirped once, the sound high and questioning. Lindiwe let out a low purr, deep, resonant, maternal. And in that sound, Sifo heard everything. Approval, reunion, release. The rangers couldn't believe it. One of them whispered, "It's like she was waiting for this." Sifo nodded slowly. She was. That moment became the turning point. Over the next week, Temba was gradually acclimated to a safe zone near the main reserve, with Lindiwe appearing at intervals. Sometimes she kept her distance, other times she lay nearby. Sifo realized she was teaching, not forcing, not claiming, but guiding. And Temba, in turn, responded with a mixture of boldness and caution, learning how to be wild again, but without forgetting where he came from. It was a rare balance few had seen before. The local media caught wind of the story and began to ask questions. A photographer from Johannesburg arrived, hoping to capture the lioness at the grave. At first, Sifo refused. "This isn't a spectacle," he said, but Thandi convinced him otherwise. "If people understand what this bond means, maybe we'll get more support." So the crew followed Sifo discreetly to the grave. No one expected Lindiwe to appear again, but she did. As the team set up their lenses, she emerged from the trees and without hesitation, approached the same spot beside Peter's resting place. This time she didn't lie down. She stood, tall, still, watching, and the cameras clicked in reverent silence. That photograph would later appear on the cover of African Conservation Today with the headline, "The Lioness Who Came to Mourn." But what the article didn't capture, what only Sifo truly knew, was the way she had looked at him before disappearing into the bush once more. As if saying, "You can let go now. I'll take it from here." With that, her visits became less frequent. Temba grew bolder, stronger, faster. He learned to stalk, to pounce, to roar. But when he spotted Sifo at the edge of the reserve, he still approached, not with the dependence of a cub, but the recognition of a companion. Sifo never touched him again. He didn't need to. The bond no longer required it. As the reserve staff watched the transformation, their skepticism turned into quiet admiration. Even the inspector returned, this time without a clipboard, and asked simply, "What happens now?" Sifo smiled. "We keep watching, we keep learning." Thandi nodded. "And we protect the story, not just the animals." That week, the board approved the creation of a new sanctuary zone within the reserve, dedicated to orphaned predators. They named it Peter's Field, and Sifo was named its first guardian. For the first time in years, he felt not just useful, but called, not to save but to serve. And so, the legacy expanded. Children from nearby schools began visiting the sanctuary, learning about the lions, about Peter, about the importance of quiet kindness. One boy asked Sifo, "Did the lioness really cry?" Sifo knelt beside him and said, "She did something even harder. She trusted a human." That, more than any documentary or news report, told the real story. Not just of grief, but of healing. Not of taming the wild, but of meeting it with respect. The grave remained untouched, adorned with small stones and feathers visitors left in tribute. And every now and then, at dawn, fresh paw prints circled the earth like a silent vigil. In the quiet of evening, when the world stilled and the animals settled, Sifo would sit on the porch of the old cabin, Temba's distant roars echoing through the trees. He would open Peter's journal and add new entries, not in place of the old ones, but as a continuation. "She's still watching," he wrote one night, "but now so am I." And with that, the story of one man, one lioness, and one fragile cub found its way into the hearts of those willing to listen, not to the noise of the world, but to the silence of connection. Months passed, and the rhythms of life at the sanctuary took on a quiet certainty. The cabin, Peter's old home, had been restored with care. Its walls now bore framed photos of the cub's first steps, of Lindewi at the grave, and of Peter himself, holding a much younger version of her in a black and white snapshot. Sifo made sure the space remained simple, as Peter would have wanted. No fanfare, no loud signage, just a hand-carved plaque by the front gate that read, "Some bonds never break." And every morning as the sun cut through the trees and painted the grass in gold, Sifo made his walk along the perimeter, where he always paused by the grave. Temba had grown into a striking adolescent male. He no longer chirped for food or sought out shade near the cabin. He was learning the ways of the wild now, tracking, hunting, asserting himself, but his eyes still softened when they met Sifo's from across the observation field. The sanctuary had adjusted to support his future. Natural barriers, enriched habitats, and a slow integration plan with other orphaned lions. Temba was not just a success story. He was the living symbol of something larger, of Peter's quiet love, of Lindewi's faith, and of Sifo's own transformation from ranger to guardian. Watching him now, proud and free, Sifo felt something close to peace. The community that once questioned Sifo's actions began to rally around him. Locals brought fruit, tools, even old blankets and towels for the animals. A retired teacher offered to lead storytelling sessions for children who visited. And every Friday, Sifo hosted an open morning called Peter's Hour, where anyone could sit by the grave and listen or share stories of loss, of nature, of healing. Most spoke in whispers, some cried, but all left different than they came. As Sifo told one man, who had recently lost his wife, "Grief doesn't end, but sometimes it finds company." That idea that no sorrow needs to be endured alone became the beating heart of the sanctuary. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Peter's niece in Cape Town. She had never visited the reserve before, but had heard about the lioness and the cub through the viral photo. "I never really knew my uncle," she wrote, "but now I feel like I do. Thank you for honoring his soul the way he honored theirs." She donated funds in Peter's name to build a shaded pavilion beside the grave, a simple wooden structure with a bench and space for reflection. The first engraving on its wall read, "This was never about saving animals. It was about remembering how to feel." Sifo stood under it for the first time and wept. Lindewi continued to appear, rarely, but always at meaningful moments. She never returned to the cabin or sought direct contact, but every time Temba was reintroduced to a new zone, She would show herself at the edge of the reserve, as if inspecting, as if reminding them all. She was still part of this. Sifo believed she was teaching Temba things no human ever could. How to move through the world with strength and grace. How to be wild without forgetting kindness. And as the boy grew into a lion, she grew older too. Her steps slowed. Her visits came less often, but her legacy had already taken root in paw prints and memory. The reserve's board, once cautious and rule-bound, officially declared Peter's Field a model program for rehabilitation through emotional connection. They began training other rangers in Sifo's methods. Observation first, patience always, trust above control. It wasn't about softening the wild, it was about meeting it halfway. Sifo became a quiet leader, guiding others not with lectures but with stories. Peter didn't tame her, he would say when asked about Lindiwe. He just gave her the space to trust again. That line, simple as it was, became a kind of motto across the region. Tourists came not for spectacle, but to witness healing. Temba's roar now echoed daily across the sanctuary, deep and full. No longer a cub's cry, but a young lion's call. Sometimes Sifo would stand near the observation post at sunset, eyes scanning the horizon. He no longer waited for Lindiwe. He knew she came when needed, not when called. Her legacy lived in Temba's strength, in Peter's journals, and in every child who left the sanctuary with wide eyes and new questions. Once, a boy asked, "Why did she come to the funeral?" Sifo crouched beside him, looking toward the grave. "Because some animals grieve just like us," he said. "And some goodbyes are too big for words." The grave itself had become something sacred. Visitors didn't touch it, but many left behind tokens. Feathers, drawings, carved stones. A group of young girls planted wildflowers nearby. In spring, they bloomed in gentle yellow clusters, drawing butterflies and birds. Sifo often sat beside them, adding to Peter's journal with a worn pen. He didn't just save her, he once wrote. He gave her the courage to return. And in doing so, she gave Sifo a purpose he hadn't known he needed. He no longer feared the silence of the bush. He had learned, like Peter, that silence could hold the loudest truths. On the one-year anniversary of Peter's passing, Sifo held a small ceremony. Just 10 people. No speeches. Only a walk through the sanctuary, a moment at the grave, and a silent meal under the stars. Temba roared once at dusk, then vanished into the trees. As they sat around the fire, an elder woman whispered, "I feel like he's still here." Sifo nodded. "He is, just not in the way we expect." That night, he stayed up late writing in the journal, and when he stepped outside, he saw a shape moving slowly at the far edge of the field. Lindiwe. One last time. She looked toward him. He whispered, "Thank you." And she disappeared into the dark. By then, Sifo knew. This story would never really end. It would live on in every orphaned cub, in every grieving visitor, in every act of quiet kindness passed between species. Peter's grave wasn't a monument to loss. It was a door, a beginning. And Temba, now thriving and close to full maturity, carried that legacy in every step he took across the land. The sanctuary wasn't just land, it was memory, responsibility, love. And Sifo, once unsure of his place in the world, now walked it every day with a deep, steady peace. Because in the end, he didn't just save a cub, he didn't just honor a lioness, he didn't just protect a legacy, he found his way back to himself.